everyone, today we're going to go through this paper from AS and A-Level, and this is variant 1-1 from Major in 2024. There are usually 3 variants in the Major series, and we'll get right into it. So the first question says, a worker earns $40 per hour. Rather than work, she decides to visit a museum for 3 hours. The visit costs a total of $40. What is the opportunity cost of visiting the museum? Well, the opportunity cost is the next best alternative given up. Best alternative. So it basically means what is something else that you could have done instead of visiting the museum for 3 hours? Well, there are multiple things that you could have done instead of going to the museum, but in the case of opportunity cost, we only talk about the next best one. So if you look right here, it says rather than work, she goes to the museum. So going to work is the next best option, right? So it also says that the worker earns $40 per hour, and she goes to the museum for 3 hours instead of going to work for 3 hours. So all right, what's the next best alternative is going to work for 3 hours. If she had gone to work for 3 hours instead, then 3 multiplied by 40, you would have $120, right? Because she earns $40 per hour, 3 hours meaning $120 would be earned. So if she had gone to work instead, she would have gotten $120. So what is the opportunity cost of going to the museum? It's going to work and earning this $120. So therefore, the answer is $120, and C is our correct option. Now you might be thinking, why is it not 40? Because we see 40 twice in the question. Well, the first 40 means that, well, the worker earns $40 per hour. The second one says that the visit costs a total of $40. Visiting the museum costs a total of $40. So although, yes, this is a cost, is it an opportunity cost? The opportunity cost, like I said, is the next best alternative. Is $40 the next best thing you could do? Do you even earn $40 during 3 hours? During the 3 hours, you could have worked instead of going to the museum? Well, no. So the answer is $120. Therefore, the correct option is C. Now, the second question says, the nature of a typical car assembly plant has changed. The industry has fewer firms, operates on larger sites, and has more automated machinery. How is this change most likely to have affected the relative use of factors of production in the industry? Well, we clearly know that factors of production are the resources that we use to produce, and they include labor, land, enterprise, and capital. Now, labor is the human resources available in the economy, also known as the mental or physical effort put into producing these goods. So labor would basically be the workers who provide a service or contribute to the process of producing a good. And land are the natural resources in an economy. For example, water, the land itself, the space itself you use to put your industries and firms on, and etc., etc. Whatever that you can find naturally in the world is land. It's a natural resource that can be used for production. Enterprise is also a factor of production which organizes the other factors of production to produce things. And its function is to take risks for big rewards and to be more inventive and innovative. Now, the last one, capital is a man-made resource that helps with production, such as machinery. So there may be a machine that assembles car parts, but it is a resource that helps with production. Now, how is this change most likely to have affected the relative use of factors of production? So now it says up here that the industry has fewer firms and that it operates on larger sites and has more automated machinery. So when it says fewer firms are owned by individuals or entrepreneurs. So that means that if there are fewer firms, that means there will be fewer entrepreneurs, meaning there will be fewer enterprise. And also, workers work at firms. And if there are fewer firms, there will be increased unemployment because labor might not be demanded as much because there isn't as many firms as before. So therefore, the demand for labor may also fall, which may also lead to a decreased use in labor. And when it says operates on larger sites, Since this basically means that more space will be used for these operations, that means that more natural resources, the space itself will increase in its use, so therefore land will increase. The use of land will increase, and then it has more automated machinery. When we say machines, it's most likely capital, because capital are man-made goods, which are basically machines. So that means that if there's more automated machinery, that means capital is being used more. So therefore, land and capital, the use of land and capital will increase, and the use of labor and enterprise will decrease. So you just match that to the table, right? So land and capital will increase, the use of land and capital will increase, and the use of enterprise and labor will decrease. So for number 2, option D is correct. Now number 3. Which item would be least likely to be classed as land? As we were saying earlier, land is a factor of production that basically means that it's a natural resource. So if it says what is least likely to be land, what is least likely to be a natural resource? So choose the option that is basically not a natural resource. So now right off the bat, we can tell that fertilizers are not a natural resource, because can you find fertilizers? Can you find these fertilizers that are made of chemicals and whatnot? Can you find them naturally existing in the world? Well, no. Arguably, manure is a fertilizer, but no, in this case, we're talking about man-made chemical fertilizers, and you cannot naturally find them. So therefore, that is not a natural resource. So A is most likely not land, so that is our option, and that's correct. Number 4, why does the concept of scarcity apply to the use of fossil fuels? Alright, so scarcity is the situation in which wants and needs are greater than the resources available. So let's just tie this to the economic problem. The economic problem is where there are unlimited wants and needs, but there are limited resources. But why are there limited resources? This is because of scarcity, right? So this just means that the supply of resources is limited. So when it asks why does the concept of scarcity apply to the use of fossil fuels? Well, the concept of scarcity applies to any good or service that has an opportunity cost when produced. So basically all private goods, right? So why does it apply to fossil fuels? Because like I said, it has an opportunity cost, because it has it is a limited resource, because of limited resources. So let's just look at the options one by one. It says demand fluctuates according to price changes. Now this, although is true for a demand and supply diagram, right? Although, you know what, I'm not going to draw that anymore. This is more focused towards supply, and this concept of scarcity doesn't really tie or relate to demand that directly. This seems like a statement that is more related to the demand and supply diagram, so we're just going to cross that off. Now the second one says supply is insufficient to meet demand. Now that does summarize the economic problem and why scarcity plays a part in it. So that does make sense, so we'll just keep that in mind for now. Third one says their use is restricted because of harmful pollution. Now this kind of sounds like a demerit good because of harmful pollutions, because of these harmful external effects. However, is that related to scarcity or any part of this? Not exactly, so we'll just cross that off as well. The fourth one says they are being replaced by renewable energy resources. So that doesn't exactly tie that directly to the concept of scarcity either, because scarcity does mean that it's because of limited resources. It is referring to limited resources in the economic problem. So that doesn't really directly talk about it. So we'll just also cross that off. So the answer that sounds the most correct is B, and that is correct option. Number 5, an economist knows the current point at which an economy operates within its production possibility curve. What can an economist conclude about this economy? So the production possibility curve, also known as the PPC curve, the PPC curve for short, is a diagram that shows the maximum output for two different goods. So for example, this is a production possibility curve right here. So the y and x axes each represent a good. So in this case, I'm going to do capital goods here and consumer goods here, right? So there are 3 possible points on the PPC curve. that being inside the curve, on the curve, or outside the curve. So now if your point is on the curve of a PPC curve, that means that you are using all your resources, all your available resources efficiently to produce the maximum output as much as you can. So ideally, if you are going to be producing, you would want to produce on the curve because that is your maximum limit of being your maximum output that you can produce. So producing along this line is efficient. However, if your point is inside the curve, then that means that you are not efficiently using your resources because you can move this point onto the curve, meaning you can increase your output. However, you are only producing your output at this point. So that might mean that some of your resources, which are your factors of production, may be unemployed. Most of the time, this means that there is unemployment in the country because your labor isn't being efficiently used. However, this just means that you are not producing at your maximum output and you will want to be on the curve. The third point, oh my goodness, the third point is a point outside the curve, and this is impossible or unattainable because the points along the curve show your maximum output. So anything outside of that isn't really possible. You do not have enough resources to produce outside of this curve because this curve is already your maximum boundary. So yes, there are 3 points along the curve. Now let's look at the question again. It's asking what the economist can conclude about this economy if it knows where the point is on a PPC curve. So let's just look at the options one by one. The first one says its degree of self-sufficiency. I don't know how this really ties to self-sufficiency at all. So we'll just cross that off because I also cannot think of any other economic concept that ties to self-sufficiency as of now after learning AS level. And the second one is it's an international competitiveness. Now, international competitiveness is usually associated with exports being cheaper and becoming more internationally competitive. Whereas here, the PPC curve does not really talk about international competition. It's just about the maximum output of two different goods. So no, that can't be it. Now, the third one says its level of output of two goods. You know what? That sounds about correct because the curve itself the diagram itself does show the maximum output of two different goods, and well, depending on where the point is, you know how efficiently it's being produced, or maybe not being produced because this is a point outside the curve isn't possible. But besides that, that seems possible, so we'll just keep that in mind. Now the last one says its rate of economic growth. Economic growth is an increase in the production of goods and services within an economy over a specific period. So if the PVC curve shifted to the right, that means, that's very wonky, but let's say this new red line is the curve that's the new curve, so it's shifted to the right. That means that its productive capacity has increased due to economic growth. So yes, on a PPC diagram, yes, you can show economic growth by the shift of the curve. However, the question only states that the economist knows the current point at which the economy operates. So it only knows its points inside, along the line, or outside the line. So not how it shifts. It doesn't really talk about the curve shifting. But if the curve did shift, then economic growth is possible. However, it's only talking about the points, so that can't be it. It doesn't talk about the shifts, so we'll cross that off. So the most possible answer is C, and that is the correct answer. Number 6, an increase in which factor is likely to cause a shift to the left of the demand curve for cinema movies. Now, because this talks about a demand curve, right, we can safely assume that we are going to need to draw the demand and supply diagram for this one. So let's just do that. Downwards is D, upwards is, upwards is S, the demand curve and supply curve, and your y-axis is your price, and this is quantity demanded or quantity supplied. So this asks what is a factor that is likely to shift the demand curve to the left. So that means that the demand is going to decrease overall for it to shift to the left. So which of these factors will affect demand? Now let's see. The first one says, expenses for the heating system in the cinema. Now, expenses for the heating system in the cinema sounds like a cost of production. And if it concerns cost of production, then that usually affects the production. That usually affects the supply curve, because if your cost of production increases, you are less willing to supply it. So therefore, the supply curve will shift to the left. However, this affects supply, not demand. That's not what we're looking for, so cross that off. Cross that off. The second one says, payments charged by movie script writers. Payments charged by movie script writers also sounds like a cost of production to the cinema, because think of this payment as wages. If the cost of wages increase, if the payments charged increases, then that will also increase your cost of production. So again, suppliers are less motivated to produce or supply this good because it's become more expensive to do it, so that will mean less profits. So increased cost of production shifts of the supply curve to the left, not demand curve, so cross that off again. The third one says the cost of transport to the cinema. So this means that your transportation to the cinema has become more expensive. So for example, maybe I go to the cinema by bus because I don't own a car and I don't have a driving license either. But I go to the cinema by bus, so if the bus fare rose or the cost of transport increases, then I am less likely to go outside or to go to the cinema by bus because it's become more expensive now. So less people might be willing to go to the cinema because it's become more expensive to go there. So therefore, the demand may fall. Not the supply, it affects the demand. So the demand may fall, therefore the demand curve may shift to the left. So you know what, that's possible. Let's keep that in mind. And the last one says taxes on the incomes of cinema operators. Taxes on the incomes can basically mean the taxes on what the cinema operators earn, or like profits, their revenue. So if the taxes increase, that means there is a greater cost to supplying it. So that can also count as the cost of production. So as the cost of production increases, then they are less motivated to supply, so the supply curve will shift to the left. But that shifts the supply curve, not the demand curve, so cross it off as well. So C is the only factor that affects the demand curve, and it correctly shifts it to the left, and that's what we're looking for. So C is the correct option, and that's correct. Number 7. 4 firms supply the market. The market supply is 50 units at $20 and 100 units at $40. The table shows the market share of each firm at the 2 prices. Which firm does not have a normal upward sloping supply curve? Okay, let's break down the information first. So first of all, it says 4 firms supply the market. So this will be the supply curve for 4 firms, right? And of course, obviously, supply curve is upward sloping, so that's your supply curve. Y-axis is the price, x-axis is the quantity supplied or quantity demanded. In this case, since we're only looking at the supply curve, it will just be quantity supplied. And it says here that the market supply also can be seen as the quantity supplied is 50 units at $20 and 100 units at $40. So let's just mark that. So at $20, the quantity supplied is 50 units. But at $40, right, it will be at 100 units. Now it says that the table down here, right, shows the market share of each firm out of the 4 firms at the 2 prices, at these 2 prices. Now it asks which firm does not have a normal upward sloping supply curve. So to figure that out, we're just going to take each of these pieces of data for each firm and try to figure out the supply curve for each of them. So looking at the first piece of data, it says that for the firm A, let's just call it that, it says that the percentage of market share at 20% for firm A is 10. So 10% has a 10% market share at $20 and a 10% market share at $40 as well. Okay, but wait, what is the market share exactly? It is the proportion of a market that a business controls in order to satisfy customer needs. In simpler terms, it basically means how much it produces or supplies to contribute to the total supply. So look at it like this, all right? So at $20, the total units supplied is 50 units, right, at $20. And firm A contributes 10% to this 50 units. So how much did it actually supply at $20? Well, that's easy. It supplied 10% of 50 units. So just multiply 0.1 with 50 and you get 5. So therefore, the quantity supplied of firm A at $20 is 5 units. So do the same with the quantity supplied at $40. So at $40, 100 units are supplied. What is the percentage that firm A, firm A contributed to at 100 units? So it contributed 10%. So of course, out of 100, that means that it supplied 10 units. Now do the same calculation for every firm to find out the quantity supplied of each firm at $20 and $40. All right, to make it simpler, since at $20, right, 50 units are produced. So we put 50 up here. At 40, it is 100 units. Now, let's find out the quantity supplied for firm B. To do that, since it is 20%, 0.2 multiplied by 50, that will be 10 units. And since it's 50% at 50 units, that will just be 50 units supplied. And for firm C, since it's 30%, 0.3 multiplied by 50, that's 15 units. And 20%, 20 units again. And then at 40%, that will be 0.4 multiplied by 50, which is 20 units. And 20%, 20 units again, since it's out of 100 units, right? So now that we have the quantity supplied each at the price of $20 and $40, we can now guess the supply curve for each of these firms. Now let's draw a little template for our supply curve for each of these firms, because the one up here is the one for all 4 firms, and that doesn't really count. So here we have price and quantity supplied, and obviously the supply curve will be upward sloping, but let's just look at the data first, all right? The first one says at $20, let's say firm A actually. So at $20, we have 5 units of supply. So all right, $20 here, and we have 5 units of quantity supply, and I'll just do it right here. And then at $40, we have 10 units that are supplied. So since it's 40, that's 2 times 20, so we'll just put that up here. And since 10 units will be about 2 times the size of this as well, so around here. So we can guess that our points will be like this, and yes, it is indeed upward sloping. Now let's look at the second set of data for firm B. So now this time this will be for firm B. Now at $20, we have 10 units of quantity supplied. So right, let's just put 10 right here. And then at 40, we have 50 units supplied. So since, let's say, here is 20, 30, 40, let's say 50 is right here. So since it is 10 units at $20 and 50 units at $40, yeah, that looks like an upward sloping curve to me. So we'll go and check the next one, which is firm C. Firm C says that at $20, we have 50 units supplied. 15 units supplied, 15 units supplied right here. And at $40, we have 20 units supplied. So let's assume that this is 10, so we will have 20 right here. So at $20, it will be 15 units. $40, it will be 20 units. So yeah, that seems like an upward sloping one too. So it must be the last one. Oh, it must be the last one. Firm D. Firm D says that at $20, it will have 20 units of quantity supplied. Let's put 20 here. And 20 units again, so we're just using the same point here at $40. So $20, you have 20 units. $40, you have 20 units again. So that is a straight vertical line, which is also known as a perfectly inelastic supply curve. And is that upward sloping? No, it's perfectly straight. So this must be the one that does not have a normal upward sloping curve. So our answer is D, and that is correct. Now let's just erase this part for space below. So question number 8. It says, which statement is correct? All right, let's just look at each of the options and see which one is correct then. So the first one says, demand for an inferior good has a positive relationship to income and a negative relationship to price. So first of all, what is an inferior good? Well, the inferior good is related to the income elasticity of demand, also known as YED. So no matter what the coefficient value is, if the value has a sign, a minus sign, then that means that it's an inferior good. And what does that indicate? Since YED refers to the responsiveness of quantity demanded to a change in income, if the coefficient value is positive, that means that both of them will have a direct or positive relationship, meaning if income increases, so will quantity demanded. However, in this case, since this is a negative sign, that means that the relationship will be negative. So the relationship between quantity supplied and income will be inversed, meaning if income increases, let's say, then the quantity demanded will fall because they have an inverse relationship, because they have an inverse or negative relationship, and that is the case for an inferior good. It says demand for an inferior good has a positive relationship to income. Well, that's not true, because if that were true, that means if income increases, then the demand or the quantity demanded will increase. But since this is an inferior good, the relationship should be negative, meaning if one thing increases, the other thing should decrease. So if income increases, demand or quantity demanded for the inferior good should decrease. But since this suggests that it has a positive relationship, that is wrong, because that should be a negative relationship. Okay, however, let's look at the second part, which says that it has a negative relationship to price. Demand has a negative relationship to price for an inferior good. This part is true, because this is true for all goods, because according to the law of demand, if the price increases, since it's become more expensive, consumers will be less attracted to buying these goods. So therefore, the quantity demanded will fall. But if the price falls, then it becomes more cheaper. So it's more attractive to buy more. So that means demand will increase and quantity demanded will increase. So by the law of demand, the relationship between price and quantity demanded will always be negative or inversed. And this is true for all private goods. And an inferior good is also a private good. So when I say private goods, I mean goods that require or have an opportunity cost when you produce them. And all inferior goods are private goods, because to produce goods in general, you will face an opportunity cost, because you will need to use factors of production or, well, other resources to produce it. So although yes, this second part about demand having a negative relationship with price is correct, this first part is not correct, so we'll cross that off. Now let's read the second one. Option B says demand for an inferior good has a negative relationship to income and a negative relationship to price. And you know what? This is correct, because as I've explained inferior goods earlier, it does have a negative relationship to income. Demand for an inferior good does have a negative relationship to income. And yes, by the law of demand, demand also has a negative relationship to price. So let's just keep this option in mind and look at the next one. Option C says demand for a normal good has a positive relationship to income and a positive relationship to price. Now, what is a normal good exactly? Well, like I said earlier with inferior goods, if the sign in front of the value of the YED is negative, that will be an inferior good. However, if it is positive, then it will be a normal good. And that means that it will have a positive relationship with income and quantity demanded, meaning if income increases, quantity demanded will also increase. So demand and income has a positive relationship. Yes, this part is correct. But the second part says that demand has a positive relationship to price. Now, like I said, with the law of demand, that is not true. It will have a negative or inverse relationship. So although the first part is correct, the second part isn't, so we're going to cross that off and look at the next option. The next one says demand for a normal good has a negative relationship to income and a positive relationship to price. Now, no, demand does not have a negative relationship to income if it's a normal good. If the good has a negative relationship to income, if the demand for it has a negative relationship with income, that will be an inferior good, not a normal good. And the second part is also still wrong. No, according to the law of demand, demand and price will always have an indirect or inverse or negative relationship. So if we look at all of the options, option B makes the most sense because both facts about its relationship with the inferior good and its demand and price relationship is correct. So D will be our option, and that is correct. Now, number 9. In which row are both statements correct? So to find out, let's look at our options first. Now, by looking at this table, I can assume that by the heading of consumer surplus and producer surplus, that the column below should have something related to this term or the definition of this term. So first of all, what is a consumer surplus? Well, actually, let's just draw the diagram to also visualize it in our heads. So on a demand and supply diagram, the producer surplus and the consumer surplus can both be shown. So the downward sloping curve is demand curve, upwards is supply curve, and you have price and quantity demanded here. And the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity is right here. So this point itself is the equilibrium point, and here we have our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. So the consumer surplus as a definition is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the equilibrium or market price. This basically means that, like I said, this area represents the consumer surplus. Let's say the consumer really likes this product, so they are willing to pay all of these prices above the equilibrium price. So this top part right here is the maximum price the consumer was willing to pay for it, but this is the price that they got to pay for it instead. So it seems cheaper, right? Because they were willing to pay this much. So that means if the consumer surplus is larger, then that's better because that means that your consumers feel like they are gaining more because there is a larger consumer surplus. And the definition of a producer surplus is the difference between the price a producer is willing to accept for a good and service versus what they actually received. So if this was the lowest price the producer was willing to produce at, they actually got to produce at this price instead. So that's better, right? Because they get a higher price, so higher profits. So the higher the producer surplus, the more that the producers gain. Well, not necessarily the consumers, because this is the producer surplus, so they have their own benefits. But anyway, now that we know the definition, let's read what the table has given us. So let's check the consumer surplus column first. So it says, the first option A says the value that the consumers gain from consuming a good over and above the value that would have been gained from consuming the next best alternative. All right, now this is a bit wordy, but when I see the next best alternative, I know that that is referring, or that is what you would use to describe the opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is not really related to the consumer surplus directly, because it's mainly about the maximum price, mainly about it being a difference, this difference, right, between the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay and the equilibrium price, or the price the consumers actually had to pay at. So when it says that the value that the consumers gain, so this is the value that the consumers should gain technically from consuming a good over and above the value that would have been gained from consuming the next best alternative. You know what? That doesn't make sense because that doesn't talk about the equilibrium price or the market price or the price that it's paid at. And it's not talking about how this is the value that it's gained, that the value between its maximum price it was willing to pay and the equilibrium price. So it doesn't talk about that. It instead uses these keywords that would actually define the opportunity cost. It's a bit weird, so we'll just skip over that. So we'll look at the next option first and see if it makes any more sense. The second one says the value that the consumers gain from consuming a good over and above the price paid. Now that makes sense because it's talking about the value that the consumers gain from consuming a good over and above the price paid. So over and above the price that they paid, since the price that they paid is the equilibrium price, over and above it is the value that the consumers gain by consuming or buying that good. So yes, that is true. This is the value that the consumers gain. So this fact is correct. Now let's just keep that in mind and check the next option. And says, well, that's actually the same. This is the same as this. So both of these are correct. And at a closer look, this one's actually the same as the first one. So this doesn't make sense. We prefer this answer. So we're going to check the columns next to these two for producer surplus now. Now, the first one says, the difference between the price received by firms for a good or service and the price at which they would have been prepared to supply that good. So it says the difference, right? Between what? Between the price received by firms, which is also known as the market price, because that is the price that they receive or the price that they are told to produce at. So starting from here, the difference starting from here, and the price at which they would have been prepared to supply that good. So this is the minimum price that producers would have been willing to supply the goods. So this whole area right here is the price for which the producers were preparing to supply that good at. So yes, this makes sense, right? Now let's check the next row and see what it says. This next one says, so the difference between the actual revenue received by firms for a good and the profit maximizing revenue. So at this point of AS level, we don't know what profit maximizing is, but we do know what profit is, and we know what actual revenue is. And, well, the difference between actual revenue and profit will be the total cost, not the producer surplus. And also, this isn't even the profit, it's profit maximizing revenue. We actually don't know what that is. So this doesn't make sense, so we'll just cross that off. And these two options make sense, so option B will be your answer, and that is correct. Now, number 10. Number 10 says, a firm calculates that the income elasticity of demand for its product is minus 3.0. What can be deduced from this information? Okay, what is the income elasticity of demand? Income elasticity of demand, also known as YED for short, is the responsiveness of quantities supplied to a change in income. So the formula for this would be the percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income. So one thing you need to know about YED is that if, depending on the value, whatever the coefficient is, it can be any figure, if the sign is minus, then that means that it's an inferior good, which means that it will have a negative or indirect or inverse relationship between a change in quantity demanded and income. So for example, if income increases, then quantity demanded will decrease because that's how an inverse relationship works. So if there is a minus sign in front of it, it will have a negative relationship. However, if it has a positive sign in front of it, then that will be a normal good, and that will just function the way that it normally does. It will have a direct or positive relationship between a change in quantity supplied and a change in income, meaning if income increases, then quantity demanded will also increase, just like any normal good, because if your income increases, you will have more disposable income, more purchasing power, you will clearly buy more stuff and demand more things, so your quantity demanded will increase. So that is just a normal good. So, like I said here, if it has a negative sign, right, that means it will be an inferior good with a negative relationship between quantity demanded and income. And if we look at the YED value, which is minus 3.0, it has a negative coefficient, so we know that this will be an inferior good. Now, what else? Well, we know that the coefficient is 3.0, so what does that information tell us? Alright, now just remember this. Whatever elasticity we talk about, whether it be income elasticity of demand, also known as YED, price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of supply, PED, PESP, or YED, also XED, cross elasticity of demand, just remember this. Alright, if the coefficient, so first of all, just look at this number line. This will have 1 in the center and 0 at one pole and infinity at the other pole. So Elasticity is always about responsiveness, so you would assume that the greater the value is, the more responsive or the more elastic it becomes. Or, if the value decreases, then it will become less responsive and less elastic or inelastic. So, if the value of the PED, YED, whatever elasticity it is, if it is between 0 and 1, then that means that it will be inelastic. However, if the value is between 1 or infinity, it will be elastic. And as bonus information, if the value is exactly 0, that means that it is perfectly inelastic. And if the value is exactly 1, then it will be perfectly unitary. Well, there isn't perfectly unitary, but that means it will be unitary. And if it is exactly equal to infinity, then it will also be perfectly elastic. So this is the way I remember this. Now, if we look at 3.0, that is between 1 and infinity. So that means that this value is elastic. So we also know that this YED value refers to an elastic value. Quantity demanded is very sensitive or very responsive to a change in income. Right, now that we have this information, let's check our options and see what the answer will be. So first one says, in a period of economic growth, its total revenue should increase. Well, economic growth just basically means that the production of goods and services increases, which can also be interpreted as GDP increasing, which is gross domestic product. This basically means that output is increasing. So if output increases, then demand for labor increases. So employment will increase. And this is because labor has derived demand, meaning that the demand for something else has to increase for the demand for labor itself to increase. So because the demand for labor has increased and employment has increased, that means that more people will get employed, and that means that more people will be receiving incomes or receive higher incomes. That means in the economy, with economic growth, people will be receiving more incomes. So this just basically means that, well, yeah, incomes are rising. So now it says because incomes are rising, its total revenue should increase. So let's look at what the information said again. Because the YED is minus 3.0, that means that the goods in the economy that we're producing are inferior goods. So that means that the relationship between quantity demanded and income will be indirect, meaning if incomes increase, then that means that quantity demanded of this inferior good should decrease. However, it says that its total revenue should increase, meaning which is suggesting that its sales have increased. So if the sales increases, that just basically means that quantity demanded has increased. However, this is not true in the case of an inferior good because it will have an indirect or negative relationship between quantity demanded and income. Again, if this were a normal good, then yes, this option makes sense. However, this firm is producing an inferior good, so that can't be it. So let's just cross that off and look at the next option. So the next one says, in a period of economic recession, its total revenue should increase. So if there is an economic recession, that is the opposite of economic growth. So that means that the production of goods will fall, GDP will fall, or the output of goods will fall, and because labor has derived demand, meaning the demand for the demand for labor depends on the demand for something else, such as goods and services and output. Since the demand for output because output is reducing, that means that labor will be demanded less, and that means that there will be less employment, so incomes are likely to be falling. Okay, and so incomes are falling now, and it says that its total revenue should increase, which also just suggests that its sales have increased or its quantity demanded has increased. Now, while incomes are falling, quantity demanded for goods increases. Now that is a negative relationship between income and quantity demanded, and that checks out with inferior goods because a firm produces these. So that is a possible option, and we'll keep that in mind. Now let's look at the next one. It says that it has fewer substitutes, so it should increase its price to increase its total revenue. Now, the factor of having few substitutes is actually related to PED, or price elasticity of demand. If a good has fewer substitutes, that means that it is not easily replaced, so that would make it a luxury good or a good that is very inelastic, meaning that the quantity demanded is not that responsible to a change in price. However, yes, this is related to PED, not YED. Don't get your factors mixed up. So although if this were in the case of PED, this might make some sense, but it is not related to YED because this factor doesn't really affect it doesn't affect the elasticity of YED, so this is irrelevant. You can just cross that off. And the second one says it has many substitutes, so it should decrease price to increase total revenue. Again, this is a factor concerning PED, and if it has many substitutes, that means that it will be pretty elastic because it has many alternatives. But yeah, again, doesn't affect YED, irrelevant. You can't really apply it to the situation. So looking at our options, B makes the most sense, and B will be our answer, and that is correct.